There you go. It is Monday, July 9th, and I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and of course we are streaming live on Facebook. I am John Kane, I'm show's host and producer, and I've got Ed Schindler in studio, and I got Jake Proud on the board. I want to thank Kelly McMillan, who is our studio engineer, for our setup. Look, I want to toss a little bit of this show, or more of the show, to Ed. Ed's been joining us for the last few weeks, and I know one of the things that we have talked about in the past has been what you have chronicled, I guess, as the overlooked skills. We are oftentimes preached to about the need for education and again institutionalized education, but we oftentimes overlook the needed skills, the skills that we need to really accomplish the things that are important to us as a people, important to us as individuals, and then somewhere in between, we're important to us as a community. So let me dish it off to you a little bit on if not all of the overlooked skills that you have talked about, but certainly one of the ones that you place a high priority on is communication. And I'd like to kind of mix it up with you a little bit on just what you mean and what we should be thinking about when we talk about communication. So let me give the toss. Ed Schindler, again, thanks for sitting in and being a part of the show.
Good morning. Thank you. And what I really got going on this for was because when I went through school, we were portrayed as basically a savage communities and behind times and all that stuff. Primitive. But as I went and studied more and more, I found that we were quite a ways advanced. And it wasn't just the Haudenosaunee, it was most Native Americans were very advanced. And one of the things that was very advanced was the communication, okay? Because we didn't have just one dialect. We had many dialects, and we were talking about things which were relevant to the people, and more importantly, to the future of our people. We were referring to communication. And communication is basically, you have to understand that communication is realizing and presenting your thoughts and concerns. It's an important skill, and one that isn't really emphasized in today's education system. It's more of an indoctrination where you just memorize whatever you're being told to memorize. And communication requires basic skills from all parties. There's skills in language, speaking, writing, performing, awareness, patience, artwork, all kinds of ways to communicate, okay? But there's more basic skills needed than those I just mentioned, and those are skills such as self-respect, self-confidence, a sense of belonging.
But all those things really contribute to communication.
They contribute to communication, and they also place us within, say, that sense of belonging means that we're not the rulers of the universe or the rulers of the earth. We are part of the circle of life, and therefore we take care of things which may not, be us, the earth, the waters, the animals and trees, all these things which are part of this circle of life are a responsibility that we have as a people.
Well, and I also think it's important to realize that those other parts of creation are also communicating.
Yes.
And so when you talk about communication, it's not a one-way street. It is about what you put out there and then what you receive. So listening, so when we talk about like writing and speaking, there's also reading and listening. And and so when you're talking about our relationship with creation, you've got to put an emphasis on what we are reading, what we are hearing, what are we are observing about what nature and what creation is communicating to us. It's not about waiting for the hand of God or God to send you a sign. You told a
Yes.
you told a funny story. I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to go back and just tell a story to put it in perspective, but
Yeah.
and it's look, it's we're not trying to promote a Christian belief system, but tell your story
Yeah.
about the woman facing
The
calamity.
story is basically about this flood that's happening, and a woman's in her home, and she sees this boat coming. They offer a ride to her, and she says she will depend on God, that she believes in God, so she won't get in the boat. And the water keeps rising. The next time they come by in a larger boat, and she's in the second floor of her home, and she still says she will not forsake God. She believes that He'll take care of her. And the third time they come in a helicopter and drop down a line for her, and she says she still believes in God.
And she's praying.
Shortly after that, her house gets swept down by the flood, and she goes with it, and she dies, and she drowns. And the story goes on that she reaches the gates of heaven and meets God and says, "Why didn't you save me? I believed in you." And the response was, "I sent 2 boats and a helicopter. What more did you want?"
So clearly, her ability to listen, to observe, and to respond to to what was being presented to her was being blinded by the fact that she had a very specific thing that she thought she was waiting for, which was the hand of God to help her, as opposed to understanding that there are signs being offered all over the place. In this case, by people trying to help her. But this is kind of the human experience, right?
Yes.
Where we become so narrowly focused on what we think is the solution that we ignore many other potential solutions. And this is that proverbial heading down a path and never thinking that maybe the path was wrong, and so you continue to make. We can say the same thing about laws that are passed. A bad law gets passed, and so they try to keep fixing it, and they build bad law on top of bad law on top of bad law instead of saying, we should have scrapped the whole thing in the first place and clean the slate and start over again. And and this is the whole thing whether you're building a house or whether you're building a family. There's some things that you have to say, no, look, what I'm doing isn't working, and rather than trying to tweak what isn't working, maybe it's time to start over. And now, I don't mean start over with your family, but start over with your approach to how you approach your family,
and how to learn from others. And the other thing that I was going to talk about was commitment. And commitment's different from just having a desire to achieve something. Commitment, you understand the purpose and the cause. So it's not just achieving something. So it's actually achieving something and understanding why it is of importance, and therefore having it more than just a desire to do something. It's a desire that something is maintained, such as taking care of how we live in this earth in order for the future to be able to have what we have and continue. That's a commitment.
Well, and to to parse that out, there's a difference between being committed to something and being stubborn about something. I mean, a lot of people can be set in their ways, and that's not the same thing as being committed to an ideal or to a solution. That sometimes can preclude a solution. And so the idea of a commitment is not necessarily making an immovable commitment to the way you're addressing a problem, but really taking the time to re-examine what the problem is and whether the current path you are on is addressing it or not.
Yeah, and you'll find that one of the skills to develop is a desire to share. Okay? Now, there's going to be a lot of things people learn throughout their lives, throughout experiences, throughout interaction with other people, and then their ability to share that with others. Okay? And there's two reasons to share what I can see. One is to share by giving what you have. The other is to share so that you can understand their response and understanding, because that's one of the things that exists within our culture is that um, something is not considered the way it is for everyone, and it's understood that there's this understanding. This is what I learned. Okay, that's not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong. It's just how I understand things, and that's sharing. That's sharing what you've learned and what you understand. And
Well, and when we talk about teachers, for
yes,
instance, or people who sometimes we refer to them as the enlightened ones, the ones who will help lead us to knowledge, not provide us with knowledge. Because, and I think this is to your point, it's one thing for me to share my experience with somebody, but for me to dictate that my experience and the way I interpreted that experience must be the way that you interpret it. And because that's, that I can just share you the way I perceived my experience. And the hope is when you experience a similar circumstance, then you will at least have some body of knowledge to say, okay, I know, I've heard of this before. And in fact, maybe you've heard 3 or 4 different experiences that people have had with the same circumstance. And those, what you were taught or what was shared with you is not intended necessarily, or the intention isn't to dictate your response, but to prepare you for something that will then become your experience. Because it is when you experience something that knowledge is gained. You're not really learning from what you're hearing or reading or seeing of somebody. When somebody tells you to believe them. Oh, believe me. This is what's going to happen. That's different than saying, well, I appreciate what you shared with me, and hopefully, what you shared with me will keep my eyes a little wider when I experience that, because that's when knowledge is gained.
yeah. There's this basic skill that is not very dominant in this culture, today's culture, and that's listening. Because a lot of people don't realize what listening is. They think it's keeping quiet while someone else speaks, or they listen in order to respond. They don't listen to understand. They listen in order so they can respond to what they heard. Okay. It's
Well,
really,
that reminds me. It's I know it was in a movie. I think it was in White Man Can't Jump or something like that.
yeah.
But I've heard this expression where when a woman tells you that she's thirsty, that she doesn't want you to get her a drink. What she wants you to do is to understand what her experience is. She's telling you what she wants you to thirst to empathize with her thirst, so to speak.
Yes.
And of course, I won't get into trying to understand women. That's a whole nother show that I'm not qualified to do. But there along these things, when you listen, just like when you read, sometimes it's not that you're what you're seeing or hearing is demanding an immediate response, but rather, like you said, an understanding of a circumstance. And so, when you hear somebody even talking about thirst, sometimes a drink isn't what solves that thirst. And so the whole idea is to understand, okay, when she or anybody else says that they are thirsty, are they really saying they want a drink of water, or what is it that they're communicating? And I think that's the difference between hearing and listening, I guess, or listening only so you could, like you said, so you're trying to anticipate the response that you have to give or provide for what you're hearing.
And there's also things to listen to besides the words. There's gestures. There's
Body language, yeah.
tone of voice and volume. And those things say just as much as the words do many times. And it's important to pay attention to those things also. And within our culture, we do what's called the ganonyo. And it's becoming of one mind because it's acknowledging the all the things within this circle of life which provide for us and the ways in which they provide for us, and giving acknowledgement and respect to that. And in doing so, we become of one mind, so that because we turn our attention to those things which provide for us. And Then there's an aspect called stirring the ashes. And that's stirring the ashes is when the fire dies down. You stir the ashes because there may be some fire still in the under the ashes. What it basically refers to is having everyone participate. Someone may be sitting there quietly and everything, and not really participating in the discussion or the participating in the meeting. But you want to have people participate because you want to understand that, and that's why they say we should stir the ashes. And as you listen, these things that we speak of in English, they have words within our culture.
Well, in that stirring of the ashes, and I think you pretty much nailed it, but let me kind of reemphasize. There's two components to that whole idea. One is, look, we know in every crowd of people there are those who are very vocal and who have no problem being seen and heard. But then we do have others that oftentimes can remain silent and either can be overlooked for their input, or sometimes they prefer to be silent only so they can perhaps say, "Yeah, I was there, but I never agreed with anything that I heard." And so that's the kind of person who will bitch about something later when they had the opportunity. So the idea of stirring the ashes is both to involve those people who perhaps don't feel like they have the opportunity to be involved, but it's also the again, the metaphor is to make sure that those who have been intentionally hiding are stirred into participating in the conversation or participating in the issue. So their silence cannot be used as a weapon later on. So there's two sides. The whole issue of stirring the ashes is about participation. But I think there's two components to those who do not participate. There are some who feel like their voice has no value, and then there's others who would rather remain silent to complain about something afterwards. So I think the metaphor of stirring the ashes is to address both of those types of perhaps those who would sometimes just remain silent.
Yeah. Another skill following listening is comprehension. Understanding what was provided and presented and how it's of value to you. And not only of value to you, but how is it of value to others? And if you have any questions, what are the questions? How can those be addressed? And the same thing's true of anyone else. You can't go on the assumption that everyone knows everything. So therefore, that's why you have the communication. That's why you have the comprehension. The discussion of that comprehension helps people to understand one another and respect one another. And in doing so, it helps bring about resolution when needed. It's that much easier, at least.
One of the our Facebook listeners, Amber, asked as per recommendation that was made to her that perhaps we carve out a few minutes to talk about our young people and not just our children and our teens, for instance. And I think the conversation that you're having is valuable because one of the things that we have a tendency to do, and each generation does it, I suppose. They seem it's easy to dismiss young people, and I find now probably more so than I remember when I was growing up. Anyway, there seems to be the sentiment that somehow that we have a lost generation that we're raising now, and of course we don't. At the same time, we don't want to accept responsibility for that, but at the same time, we are writing off our young people. We aren't empowering them, and we aren't listening to them. So the whole idea of communication, it's great to say, oh yeah, I went to and I heard some charismatic speaker, and he kept us enthralled for 2 hours straight and that kind of stuff. Well, that's fine, but what about those who have not developed those speaking skills yet? Are we so bad at listening and comprehending that we can only be entertained by entertainers? And I think that's the question, especially as we look at our young people. Look, our young people are struggling with a lot of issues, and I don't know, frankly, I don't know that the opioid epidemic is any worse than the toll that alcohol has taken on our people for so many generations. And I'm not saying it's a competition, but the reason the opiate issue has become front and center, frankly, is because now white people are struggling with it. When it was just people of color who were struggling with with crack or alcohol or whatever else, it didn't have the attention. In fact, it was a criminal issue all the time, right? And it afforded social condemnation. Now all of a sudden, the tone is shifted. Addiction is a disease, and we've got to show compassion and treatment and that kind of stuff. And I don't disagree with that, but you can hear that the tone has changed. And even though we're saying it, I don't think we're still looking at. You talk about this all the time, Ed. What is the underlying problem? I mean, the alcoholism or the drug use, those are coping mechanisms. Those are symptoms of another problem. So, I mean, the biggest question is why are our teens struggling with what they're struggling with, and not only what have we failed to do to make sure that our kids enjoy their childhood and our teens enjoy their teen life without necessarily being in a rush to heap on the stresses. I mean, look, we've got kids who are suffering from depression. We've got suicide. I mean, youth suicide was essentially unheard of. There wasn't even it was statistically so small and such an anomaly that people didn't even keep track of this stuff. I'm not saying it didn't exist in the past, but now it's undeniable. And Native people are topping the list with youth suicides. And of course, we also have a fair number that are listed as suicides, especially with women and girls that are tied to the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. So, I think as we talk about communication, our ability, our failure to communicate properly with our children, and again, on the communication side, we're talking about not just how do we speak to them, but how do we listen to them, because that is a huge problem. And so I thank Amber for the comment, because I mean, we would be remiss to talk about communication and not talk about the problems we're having right now with communicating and understanding our future. I mean, and whether we want to condemn the youth or not, they are still our future. So we better figure out what it is that we can do to facilitate them, empower them, because the reality is, each generation has solutions for that the previous generation has not addressed. Each generation has the potential to make things worse, and we could argue whether we have performed well in that regard, even as we're condemning an upcoming generation. I think there's no value in that. I think holding ourselves accountable and trying to hold our young people accountable to some extent, and teaching responsibility, and not as a burden, but as an opportunity. Because I think that's one of the things when we talk about rights and responsibilities. There are opportunities with both. I mean, there are opportunities with responsibilities to do, to not only bring in everything that each individual experiences to the table for problem solving, but even things that aren't necessarily problems. We can always do better with everything from education to environment and how we what our sense of community is. But I don't know. I just wanted to add that whole thing with the youth.
The statement that I was sharing before was, alcoholism is not a problem. It's a symptom of a problem. And we talked about that because basically people find that they're unable to reach that point of peace. And we talked about that because peace, a lot of people perceive peace as being the absence of conflict. And what we were trying to talk with each other, discuss with others about, is that the peace is not the elimination of conflict, but it's the regaining of balance, because opposite of peace is that imbalance, whether it's fear, whether it's grief, whether it's could be joy, but you're basically off balance, and you have to have the ability to regain that balance.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that the tensions that exist
Yes.
in life, in the world, whether, and not just, the human conflict, so to speak, but nature is about tensions. That's why, in our creation
Yes.
story, when we talk about the left-handed twin and the right-handed twin, the whole
Yes.
idea was to understand that you could not create something of beauty and have it last forever. So there's certain things that you do to balance it off. I mean, there is a reason that berry bushes have thorns. The reason berry bushes have thorns is because if they all were consumed, if all the berries were consumed, then there would be nothing to replace those plants the next season. It's the fact that some of those berries drop their seeds. And why do they drop the seeds? Because not all of the berries can be gotten after. So
Yes.
I mean that's one example. But we talk about the tensions of nature. I mean, look, trees compete for sunlight, and what they do is they balance each other. That's why you can look at a mountain covered with trees, and they look so uniform. And there's nobody trimming those trees. And the fact is that if a tree gets too much bigger than the others, that's the one that gets affected by and becomes the windfall, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so nature has a way of addressing the tensions that are caused by nature. And so when we talk about skana, what we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
is how do we address the tensions to create harmony and balance. Not necessarily how do we do away with conflict. I mean, when we developed the Guyana de Goa, it was about developing a process to maintain and work towards peace, not to eliminate conflict. I mean, I know people. They take the story of burying the weapons under the tree of peace. That once we eliminated the weapons, there would be no conflict. No, that wasn't in the language. What it says symbolically, the weapons are buried to demonstrate burying the what causes the conflict. We're going to bury. When we talk about burying the hatchet, we don't literally bury our tools. We bury the reason. We suppress the reasons for the conflict, and so that's not the same thing as as avoiding conflict altogether. That we come up with a process that will allow us to resolve conflict, and that's what the Guyana de Goa is all about.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you develop as you get older is called empathy. Okay? It's to realize and respect that different people have different perceptions, even if it's the same occurrence.
Well, and people don't oftentimes understand the difference between sympathy and empathy.
empathy.
Why don't you describe that a little more clearly?
A lot of times the sympathy is misunderstood because sympathy is basically feeling bad for a person, whatever it is that they're feeling. Okay? Empathy is understanding what they feel and hopefully beyond that, understand why. Okay?
So in other words, it's feeling what they're feeling, not
Yes.
feeling sorry for them, but feeling, trying to put yourself in their place and understand what they're feeling, not necessarily make a judgment about their circumstance or their about their sorrow or whatever else. I mean, whatever the circumstance is.
Yeah. One thing is to understand that this does not mean that you have to agree with them, but by understanding one another, respect and agreement are much easier to reach. Okay? Because if you understand why a person is coming from whatever perspective they are, it's a lot easier to deal with each other's needs and desires.
Well,
Okay?
and you can't empathize with a person if you don't essentially take yourself
Yes.
out of your comfort zone and place
Yes.
yourself in their circumstance. I mean, that's what to be empathetic or what empathy is about is shedding even some of your preconceptions and trying to the best you can those who are the most empathetic are the ones who genuinely can leave themselves behind
Yes.
and and then then experience what somebody else is experiencing, if it is only for the moment.
For the yes.
Hey, look,
No,
we're at the bottom of the hour, but I think empathy
Okay.
is a good topic, and we'll pick it up when we come back. We'll just take a brief break, go off a little bit more music. I'm John Kane. This is Ed Schindler, and we'll be right back. This is Let's Talk Native.
Can't you hear the baby crying? Can't you see the parents trying to give their child a better life? He works an honest day for his honest pay. Still can't seem to get ahead. Stay on that straight and narrow path. Don't give up now. How long can this last? The time will come when night skies don't finish last. When the good don't die young, you know the time will come. The time will come. Say that your heart is cold, been hurt so many times before. Don't turn your back on precious love. 'Cause there's somebody walking around feeling like you are now. They ain't gonna come to your front door. Open up your heart, don't get down. What goes around will surely come around. The time will come when night skies don't finish last.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I've got Ed Schindler in studio. I've got Jake Proud on the board. And I'll thank my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420 and Tandanega. I want to thank Mike General with Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium. And I want to thank individuals who make contributions to this show from time to time. Folks like my good friend here, Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Roger Jock, Neville Spring, and many others who have helped in the past, even if they aren't helping currently, because we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be in our 9th year if we didn't have many people along the way who have supported this show and have enabled us to educate, entertain, and inform for the last 8 years. So I thank all of you for that. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And again, I want to thank CKWE for their simulcasts and their rebroadcasts, as well as our internet partners, the internet networks, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for carrying our show. And I also want to thank those of you on Facebook who have Facebook group pages that allow us to post our Facebook live stream on your group pages. That's one of the ways that we get this show out there, and we're able to have some decent participation. And it seems like we've been getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 plus views per show. And look, is everybody staying through an hour? I don't know, but at least we know we're getting some part of this conversation out there, and I think that's what's important. And again, I think this conversation is a part of that communication that we're talking about. One of the things, and you mentioned it earlier, Ed, was that communication was not only a valuable skill, but one that we were proficient in. We were great storytellers. Look, we didn't write our language down, but we had ways of not just communicating with our young, and again, many of the stories that we told were done in such a way that they would be timeless. So the story would mean the same thing today as it did 200 years ago or 200 years in the future. And oftentimes that's because we involved not necessarily the name of somebody, but more so elements of nature that don't have a tendency to change as much as, say, man does. And so I think that's one of the things. Now, the other thing is we were also skilled statesmen. Diplomacy was not just something that we didn't. That wasn't a skill set we learned from white men. In fact, it was so profound. That's one of the reasons that that the Onondaga would be called Senecas, because Seneca was a skilled Roman orator, and I think it was that very skill set that some of the Seneca statesmen displayed that contributed to being referred to as a skilled orator. But certainly our ability to communicate, even in spite of language barriers, perhaps, we were very skilled at communicating how it is that we thrived in an environment and with a system and a culture that did not have hierarchy or was not based on power and control, but more so again on skana and how we stay in balance. So I wanted to mention the fact that this skill set that we had, we don't demonstrate it so much anymore. Now it's about hiring some white man with a law degree, or oftentimes we've got somebody else doing our negotiating and our lobbying or whatever you want to call it, our diplomacy for us. Yeah. We're hiring consultants and lawyers and lobbyists to do the work that we never would have farmed out to somebody else in a previous time. And that is among the things that I'm openly critical of. I think that we are our best advocates, and I think the whole idea of redeveloping and taking back that skill set and encouraging it, especially with our young people, because look, right now one of the things that is become a bit of a news item is that there's a historic number of Native people, Native women in particular, who are running for state and federal offices in this election cycle. And for me, I just shake my head. Because if these folks are the communicators, if these are the diplomats and the statesmen, why are we losing them to their state? I mean, to me, that's like another one that got away all the time. And so when I look at, I saw somebody that I've known for many years, Kane Sisk, who is is a chief in one of the peoples in California, and she's running for state legislature, and that was in the news this week. And of course, we know that Paulette Jordan is running for governor of Idaho, and Deborah, I can't think of her name, down in Pueblo Laguna is running for Congress, and so everybody's pitching all of these Native people running for those offices, and I'm thinking that's not the skill set being put to use for our people. These are people who are seeing an opportunity within somebody else's system, and so to me, I always look at that as people who got away, that we lost another one to their system, because their constituency, by far and away, will be white people. It will not be our Native people. So that's one of my concerns. But let's get back. We're talking about empathy and the idea of being able to first begin to understand what somebody is going through emotionally, experiencing. Right. So the idea of empathy is trying to experience what somebody else is experiencing, not try to judge them or tell them, oh, you should be responding in this way. Because until you can empathize and understand why what they are feeling, you can't understand what their solution should be.
Right. From the empathy is a development of patience, patience, and people should understand that patience is simply the where the emotions are. You're giving control to the emotions, waiting for a desired effect, whatever that may be that you've concluded you're waiting for.
Well, I mean, when you speak of patience, I think of Degerundage, when he talks about conflict, for instance, and he describes conflict almost like you take a snow globe, right, and you shake it up, and that's conflict. You can't see anything, but eventually things begin to settle. So the patience is about letting things, become a little bit more settled, so you can deal with something when the emotions are a little less high, perhaps, and certainly when things are clear. Within our language, we talk about. We oftentimes a snowstorm is used in an expression to say we can't see our way to balance if we are in the midst of a conflict. So that patience that you're talking about is about weathering a bit of the storm, as they say, and that's again an expression that comes from our culture as well. So you can see more clearly to address an issue.
Right, because it's going to be more challenging if your emotions are running your thinking. Okay, and we've talked about this before, because the emotions are simply your conclusions of whatever situation you've been in. You've made a conclusion, and it stimulated an emotion. Okay, and there's a lot of different emotions, but if the thing is, when it becomes dominating, when the emotion is dominating your thinking, then you basically reached what we were calling conflict. You've lost peace, okay? And that's where you have to regain the balance. That means release that conclusion which stimulates the emotion. Release that, let it go, okay? And then
the pressure, I think, to rush to judgment and to come up with a quick response. Look, we understand that there are some urgent matters that require decisiveness, and sometimes time is not a friend for that. But when I look back and what I understood, and in fact when I was young, the first times I was going to Grand Council, I realized that there was no requirement to get something resolved in 1 day or 2 days. I mean, and perhaps because it was more difficult to travel and that kind of thing, to go to a central fire in Onondaga, let's say, there was no rush to get there and have a meeting and then go home. The whole idea was to deliberate. And and in fact, we would actually only deliberate till about midday, and then we would knock off. Oftentimes there would be a social or something like that, and then you'd pick up deliberation the next day. But we live in a world now where people are looking for instant gratification and immediate responses, and I suspect even with our interaction with the colonial powers and the settler colonial system. They probably didn't understand the fact that we had more patience, and that some decisions, in fact, we understood that if we couldn't come to consensus, then we would just table the issue and address it at a later date. So sometimes, if there was an issue that we felt strongly needed some resolution, we would accept the fact that sometimes we would not reach that resolution and that we would have to move on to something else. It's kind of like what I often talk about when we talk about having enough sense to understand that not everything needs to be known. Not everything is knowable. So in our quest for knowledge, creation provides us a pretty good window to so much of what's around us. But nature has a few surprises for us. And so the fact that nature holds back and doesn't allow us to understand everything fully, that's the beauty of life.
Yes. I wanted to go to the next step. As we improve our patience, okay, the next thing that really improves is camaraderie. Camaraderie is understanding that you can do things together for a purpose, for a commitment especially, and that camaraderie really helps to stimulate the understanding and the sense of belonging, that you belong with these ones who you're participating with. That is of urgence, because there's no reason, there hasn't been within our culture the concept of race. It was basically, what are we doing as we look to the future for our coming children, for the young ones? What are we doing? Because we not only have the ones who yet to be born, there's the young ones who we have to teach.
Well, and I think the concept of inclusion was that was the foundation of who we were. I mean, that's
Right.
where, I mean, even when we talk about, again, the Guyana Goa and the Ganawida, we talk about the white roots of peace, right? And we said they extend from this great tree of peace in the four directions, that anybody can follow those roots to seek shelter within the peace that was established. So the whole idea was that it was very inclusive. And so when we talk about, again, now it turns into a conversation about race and classifications of peoples and that kind of stuff. Look, we didn't even distinguish in terms of voice from the youngest of our children. We didn't say, okay, I'm sorry, you haven't earned your voice yet. No, I mean, and in fact, if a child had the ability to communicate and make a point, we would understand that, and,
Yes.
and we would embrace that opportunity to hear.
Yeah. Okay, then the things to realize that learning and practicing and participating these skills does not apply only to how you interact with other people, but it's very important for a person to realize and apply these to themselves. It's important because you are the person you spend the most time with, and therefore you need to listen to yourself, comprehend your thoughts and actions, empathize what you're doing, understanding it, show patience with yourself and whatever's involving you, practice commitment and communication.
And again, be patient with yourself.
Yes.
Because when you're in the fog of conflict, you or may not be in the best position to come up with an effective strategy
Right.
to resolve it.
And the so-called conflict may be just simply confusion.
But I mean, and
Okay.
again, this gets back to your point about camaraderie and community.
Yes.
And I talk about this all the time on the show. We exist today in a fractured state, and by that I mean we don't, between having our longhouses, separated into the nuclear family as it's called, and then we build our homes and we build subdivisions and residential development just like white people do, and we don't let a family grow, and we don't necessarily choose our neighbors, and we would have, and that's kind of the point. We don't have that sense of community that we certainly once had, and we don't really take the time to say, how do we build that sense of community back? And so when we talk about communication, well, obviously the reason to communicate effectively, whether it's speak or written, or like you said, artistic or demonstration or by example, the best way is to take that conversation, take that communication, and then turn it into an action. And that action sometimes can be an individual effort, but it is only when an individual effort to resolve a conflict gets embraced by others in that sense of camaraderie and sense of community that we begin a path forward towards improving the quality of life. Because if you only improve your quality of life while others suffer around you, then that's not improving the community's quality of life.
Yeah. One of the things that I try to emphasize for anyone is what happened. I was teaching in California, and I gave an assignment for the class individually to write something about what they felt they had lost, their people, meaning ethnicity. And one of the students said that they didn't know what to write because of all they'd learned about what we'd lost. And I said, you gotta realize.
So what you're saying is that it was a non-native student.
Yeah, they were all non-native.
So they felt awkward talking about their loss because seen others had lost what they thought was so much more.
And yes, and then what happened was I said, you've got to realize that we have lost a lot, but we still have a land base. We still have a history. We still have a culture. We still have a language and all of that. And I don't know how many of you can identify those things as part of your people. Not you, but part of your people.
Well, not to mention our loss is their loss. And I think that's the other thing that people can be oblivious to is that, and this gets down to the idea of oppressing a people. If you oppress people, then you have created disparity in all of our lives. And, so the loss of rights of somebody that may not seem like it's your loss, but if it's the loss of somebody's rights or opportunities, that comes back on all of us. So anybody's loss is the loss of one is a loss to all of us, and I think that's part of the not understanding the sense of loss. I guess.
And that goes beyond just humans. I mean, take a look at what's been lost within the creation. Okay, and why? Because some people want to make wealth, and they have the power to do it, and they create the political system to do it.
Well, and that isn't just about wealth; it's about accumulation, right?
Yes.
It's about stuff, and that's again something that we have not quite been able to reconcile how that fits into our lives culturally, and that's why I think one of the things we struggle with.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that I toward a conclusion is that these are all skills and characteristics that will provide a clearly outlined path to positive growth and development of yourself and of the relationships you have with those you meet throughout this life journey. This includes the relationship you have with yourself. Okay? It's really important to understand that it is not someone else's choice to make for you. Okay? You're the one who's going to have to make whatever choices to use and develop these skills and use them. It says no one can make that choice for you. It's yours alone. And then the last one is Jagonson. In Seneca language, in any of the language, there's no word for good luck. Jagonson means do your best.
Well, and of course we do have some control in the things that we do for our path forward. So, again, falling into good fortune is not something that is realistic. So, the idea of creating a path to improve, to carry yourself and to improve your life. I mean, I think that's all a big part of it. And I think, this again. I think part of the issue when we talk about communication and some of these necessary skills, some that we've kind of let slip away. We have to do better in terms of understanding each other. I mean, one of the things that I'll cite some of the conflicts that we've seen recently, places like at Standing Rock and other places. I mean, even as people have witnessed what's been going on with the Trump administration taking kids from families and that kind of stuff. Look, I hear people say all the time that well, we need to pray, and here's my thoughts on this thing, and I've talked about it before. I don't think prayer is a bad thing, because I think the biggest value that it has is get down to what you're talking about, this idea of self-reflection. Because I look at prayer as a meditation technique rather than requesting something from the Creator or for God or from Jesus or Allah or anybody else. I think there's almost a selfishness to asking for divine intervention, if such a thing really ever does exist. But in those quiet moments, in those recesses of your mind, when you do allow your own voice to be heard by yourself, and you do let go of some of those inhibitions to look for answers. Look, I don't know if God's going to send 2 boats and a helicopter, but the reality is there are solutions all around us if we can take the time to contemplate. And so the answers to our prayers have to do with the strategy and the actions that through our self-reflection and through the camaraderie that we take, that the steps that we take to resolve those conflicts. It's not necessarily about divine intervention. However, we came to be. In our language, the words that we talk about has to do with, we say the great mystery, but we also say the power of creation. And that is what we acknowledge. I know that people have put, a male figure in there, and we have stories that talk about the left-handed twin and the right-handed twin, but that's not the Creator. That's not really the same thing. It's a story. But when we talk about the power of creation, we also say in our culture that we will not know the name or the face or the place that power dwells. We will see the evidence of that power. And so when we see the evidence that suggests the path that we should take, and when we can find others who will be in agreement to that, and so we get that sense of camaraderie and community, there's a lot that we can accomplish. And I've seen some things, some positive movement. Obviously, there seems to be a little bit more talk about things like gardens and community gardens and efforts for us to take more control of our food supply. Look, I know they're baby steps at this point. I'm working on a tiny home project because I recognize that we have housing issues, and we also have a sense of community issues. We want to build McMansions instead of the places that are small and efficient and that bring a family closer together and force us to come out of that house to be part of a community, which is part of the tiny home concept. I also need to cite, I worked with Ross and we developed a concept for building a gazebo that could house a fire pit. And part of the thing that we do oftentimes is we sit around a fire. And we do that, we call it almost jokingly, we call it holding council, but it's what it is. That fire represents family. It represents our cultural right to assemble.
Camaraderie.
It represents all that stuff. And again, look, we're not having bonfires and having booze fests associated with it, but we developed a concept for building a gazebo that's open with an open hole in the top, so we could extend that season that we can sit outside for a fire. So we can extend it from earlier in the summer, late spring into early fall. And this is an idea that we're trying to promote as a part of a sense of community. But Ed, I want to thank you for presenting these communication ideas, and they weave themselves through every one of our shows anyway. But I wanted to spend some time specifically talking about it. So I want to thank you for your thoughts and your ideas on these concepts. I think these are the things we need to talk about. Well, we pretty much used up the hour. So again, I want to thank Ed Schiller for sitting in with us. I want to thank Ed for the support he gives to the show. I want to thank Jake Proud for the work he does here, and we'll be back here. We'll be back here on Friday. So, Nyawe for now, and we'll see you then.
Iko Nyawe.